Born on March 10th, 1693 in Wales, Edward James Kenway would spend most of his early life as a troublemaker at his family's farm up until the age of 17, where during a fight he would meet a young woman named Caroline Scott. However, due to their differences in social statuses, her father would disapprove. Regardless, the two were married in 1712, but dissatisfied with what he could provide for Caroline, Edward would soon leave to become a privateer. During this time, Edward would meet and be personally trained by Benjamin Pritchard and Edward Thatch, becoming close with his mentors. However, his time as a privateer would be short-lived, and in 1713 he would take to piracy. In the year 1715, Edward's ship would attack another one when a storm would hit, causing both to sink, leaving only Edward and one other man named Duncan Walpole the survivors. Edward would at first attempt to work with Duncan, but Duncan, believing Edward intended to kill him, would shoot the young pirate, enraging Edward, who ironically would kill him because of this. Edward would then take Duncan's clothes for himself, and in his possessions would find a letter from Governor Torres of Havana, and seeing an opportunity to get rich, would catch a ride with the stranded merchant. Upon arriving in Havana and meeting Torres, Edward and a group of people called Templars would be told about a remnant of the first civilization called the Observatory, which the Templars believed would allow them to monitor every person in the world. Torres would then take the group to meet Bartholomew Roberts. After meeting him, however, they would be ambushed by assassins, and Roberts would flee, but Edward had been able to track him down, receiving a reward. But this reward wouldn't satisfy Edward, who planned to steal Roberts and sell the observatory's location. But when he broke in to find Roberts, Edward was ambushed by the Templars, who had found out his tricks and would send Edward to London, where they planned to punish him. During a storm on the ship ride back, however, Edward and another prisoner named Adewale would break free and set loose a number of other prisoners until they had enough numbers to steal a ship and they would escape. Edward would name this new ship the Jackdaw, with Adewale serving as his second in command as the quartermaster. Edward would then head to Nassau, where his fellow pirate named James Kidd would hear his story and would take Edward to what the young pirate believed to be a hidden treasure, but was in fact the assassin headquarters, meaning the mentor Tabai, and would uncover an ancient stone sculpture of Roberts, as well as being told that he was a reincarnating member from the first civilization known as the Sage. After coming back out, Edward and Kidd would find assassins being attacked by the Templar forces, and Edward would aid them, but would ultimately be banished for taking the lives of assassins beforehand. Over the next few years, Edward would track down the Sage, continuing to work with Kidd, whom he learned was in reality a woman named Mary Read. In 1718, Thatch would decide to retire from piracy, but not before giving Edward information on Robert's location. However, as this happened, the British Navy would spring a trap and kill Thatch in front of Edward, forcing him to flee. Finding Roberts, the two would work together and eventually would find the observatory, but once inside, Roberts would betray Edward, handing him over to the British, and he would be imprisoned along with Mary and their fellow pirate Anbani. Edward would remain in prison for several months before being freed by Atabai, and the two would work to rescue Mary and Anne. However, before they made it out, Mary would die from her illness. Edward would fall into a severe depression, nearly drinking himself to death before being found by Adewale, who would resign from piracy and would join the assassins, convincing Edward to do the same. Now having joined the Brotherhood, Edward would track down and kill several Templars that he had known before, as well as Robert, before throwing his body into the ocean so that the Templars wouldn't be able to use it. Now, with no one else in his way, Edward would return to the observatory, and there he would finally kill Torres. Soon after this, Edward would receive a letter telling him that Caroline had passed away, but not before she had had his daughter named Jennifer. Edward and Jennifer would then move to London, where he would join the British Brotherhood, eventually rising to a leadership position, and would eventually remarry and would have a son named Hatham, and would even begin training the young boy as an assassin. Unfortunately, however, Edward's life was cut short on December 3rd, 1735, when a group of men would break into his house, and after confronting them, he would be killed in a fight, leaving Hatham as his living legacy. Shay Patrick Cormack was born in New York on the 12th of September, 1731. His mother would die in childbirth, and his father would spend a lot of time away thanks to his work, leaving him to be raised by his aunt. During his childhood, he would befriend a boy named Liam, and the two would grow close, considering one another brothers. As a teenager, Shay would leave to work alongside his father on a ship until the year 1747, when his father would die in the storm. This event would emotionally destroy Shay, leaving him to wander around as a drunk until Liam would find him again and give him purpose by introducing him to the Assassin Brotherhood. Shay would serve the Order faithfully, learning from his mentors and eventually becoming a trusted member of the Order, being entrusted by the Colonial Brotherhood's mentor Achilles to track down the precursor sites that would decide the fate of the world. Eventually finding a site in Lisbon, when Shay would accidentally activate the site, unleashing a massive amount of power that created an earthquake that destroyed the city. Enraged that Achilles had sent him, knowing the danger, he would confront his mentor, but after being brushed off by the entire organization, he would decide to steal the manuscript that was leading the assassins to these sites, but would be discovered, leading to a confrontation where Shay would be shot and left for dead by his former allies. He would be nursed back to health by an elderly couple, and after taking out a gang that had been bothering them, he would meet George Monroe. He would meet General George Monroe, who had rescued Shay and would convince him to help a friend of his named Christopher Gist, and together the three would begin to work at clearing New York of its gang problem. During one mission aiding Monroe and his men, Shay would run into his old mentor Kisegawase, and the assassin would learn of his survival. Later, Shay would learn that the city George had been stationed in was going to be besieged. By the time they arrived, the assassins had already begun their siege. Shay would rush to help Monroe and would end up killing Kisegawase, who would inform him that Liam had gone after Monroe to assassinate him. Shay would hurry to help his friend, but by the time he arrived, the damage had already been done and Monroe would die from his injuries. Shortly after this, Shay would be introduced into the colonial branch of the Templars by the colonial Grand Master Haytham Kenway, officially joining the Templar Order. Over the next few years, Shay would track down and kill his former friends and allies, eventually tracking Achilles and Liam to the Arctic with Haytham, where they had found another precursor site that would accidentally go off. A fight between the two sides would break out, with Liam ending up dead from a fall and Achilles crippled, with the last of his brotherhood destroyed. After this, Haytham would entrust Shay to hunt down the remaining artifacts, and from that point on, Shay would serve the Templar Order faithfully until his death. Hey everyone, I'm Ray932 here with an Assassin's Creed themed matchup for my penultimate episode for Season 1 of my Versus series, with a match I've personally been interested in for quite some time now, with the pirate-turned-assassin Grandmaster Edward Kenway going up against the assassin-turncoat Shay Cormac to see who I believe would win in a fight. Now, just for the record, I will be taking these two from around the end of their respective game and be comparing them from that point. So with that out of the way, let's get into this. By the end of Assassin's Creed 4, Edward is a 29-year-old man standing at 5 feet 10 inches tall and likely weighing around 160 pounds. Thanks to his time as a pirate and privateer, he was in excellent physical condition, being able to go toe-to-toe with men significantly longer than himself as well as trained soldiers. Was able to maintain a sprint for prolonged periods of time as well as climbing treetops and rooftops with little effort, and has survived large falls as well as explosions going off at close range and even gunshot bullets. During the events of Assassin's Creed Rogue, Shay is a 29-year-old man, and while we don't really have anything official on his height, by comparing his height to that of Haytham, who stood roughly even with George Washington, around 6 feet 2 inches tall, we can see that Shay is about the same height at around 6 feet tall and likely weighing around 180 pounds. Thanks to Shay's time as a sailor and assassin, he was in excellent physical condition, being able to contend with similarly or more physically capable soldiers, was able to parkour through the city with no issue, was able to chase a master assassin while poisoned, can fight and run for a prolonged period of time, and can easily continue moving after falling a large distance or being battered around by an earthquake. Both Edward and Shay are in excellent physical condition, both taking part in combat and parkour regularly. Not only that, but these two also have been shown to have an impressive amount of stamina and durability, being able to get back up and continue free running after large falls and serious hits that would put down normal men. In fact, there really isn't much of a difference between these two in a physical department, except the fact that Shay is a little taller and weighs a bit more, but even then that isn't too much of a difference when you consider Edward has been shown to be capable of fighting those much bigger than Shay himself. They're both roughly the same age at 29 and are both in the prime of their lives. So considering all of this, I have decided that there will be no physical edge given for these two. Edward will be bringing a grand total of 11 weapons into this fight. The first are his two pistol swords, which, as the name implies, are a pair of 2-foot-long short swords with pistols built into the grips. While historically a pistol sword of this type would have been very difficult to use in general combat, Edward seems to be able to handle these blades just fine, but seems to primarily use this function as a flashy way to finish off his opponent rather than as another tool in combat. He'll also be bringing along his 4 golden flintlock pistols, which seems to have a maximum effective range of 150 feet. However, even with that range, these weapons are historically inaccurate, and would likely be the most accurate at ranges closer to around 60 feet, meaning this would most likely be the range they would be used at. A weapon gained from his short time working with the Templars would be a pair of hidden blades, which Edward has shown the skill to use either as an assassination tool or even as a melee weapon against sword-wielding opponents. One option for stealth at further ranges are his blowgun, with two dart types, Sleep and Berserk, which both do exactly what you think. He was trained to use a rope spear by the assassins in the West Indies and can either use it for a stealth kill or in combat. He also carries a single throwing knife as a last resort ranged weapon. Finally, for protection, Edward wears a set of leather armor over his assassin robes, giving him a lightweight set of armor that doesn't interfere with his more fast-paced maneuvers, but does sacrifice some protective quality for it. Shay will be bringing a total of 10 weapons into this engagement. One 3-foot-long bastard sword custom made for use by the Templars, which he uses in combination combination with a similarly designed dagger, roughly 6 to 8 inches in length. He carries 2 flintlock pistols given to him by Achilles. However, as I said before, these weapons are very inaccurate and would need to be used at around 60 feet. For maximum accuracy. While he was an assassin, he received extensive training with his hidden blades, learning to use them both as stealth weapons or even as a substitute for more conventional melee weapons such as swords. Along with his pistols, Shay will also be bringing an air rifle, 2 dart types, and a grenade launcher. During his time as an assassin, Shay was trained to use a rope spear in various assassination scenarios and even in combat. Finally, for weapons, he carries a single throwing knife as a last resort ranged weapon. While not shown, it's implied that Shay wears leather armor under his coat, which, while sacrificing a good bit of protection, has also allowed him to stay mobile and pull off faster maneuvers in combat. Thanks to the nature of these games, Edward and Shay both have a very similar arsenal, so to save time, I'm just going to go through the ones that are identical and or cancel each other out. And these weapons are their hidden blades, Edward's blow type and Shay's air rifle, their rope spears, and finally their throwing knives. However, for the record, I do think that Shay would be better with the hidden blades and rope spear, as he was actually trained for years to use these weapons, unlike Edward, who pretty much just found these weapons and figured out how to use them for himself. Comparing their primary weapons, Shay's bastard sword is longer and more effective as a piercing weapon, while Edward's shorter pistol swords would be used better as a slashing weapon. But even ignoring that this weapon is historically impractical, lining up a shot at any range would simply be slower and less effective with this weapon than a standard flintlock. So if we were simply comparing single swords, I'd actually give it to Shay. However, when used in tandem with their second blade, Edward's dull swords give him more reach and flexibility in combat than Shay's sword and dagger combo. When it comes to their standard firearms, it's pretty simple, as Edward has 2 more pistols than Shay, but in terms of raw firepower, Shay's grenade launcher is probably the most powerful handheld weapon to be used by a protagonist, being capable of damaging structures and killing groups of enemies with a single grenade. But considering the size of the weapon, I don't think it would be better in a scenario where both men are going for their weapons at once. Their leather armor is practically identical, serving the same function with the exact same results. It's clear to me that Edward gets the edge in weapons and equipment. What, you didn't think I could compare these two and not bring out the ships, did you? No, for this episode only, I will also be comparing their ships to see which one has the better arsenal, armor, and which would be better in general naval combat. Formerly known as the El Dorado before Edward would take this ship from the Spanish treasure fleet, the Jackdaw was a brig just under 200 feet in length. This ship was equipped with a custom set of 46 broadside cannons with 23 on each side, and 4 chaser cannons equipped at the front of the ship. These cannons fire specialized cannonballs connected by chains which are meant to slow down an enemy ship. Equipped on both sides were a pair of swivel guns, which were smaller design cannons which could be operated by a single crew member for extra, more precise damage to a ship. It could carry at least 160 fire barrels, which would stay in the water and explode upon contact or if shot. For the big guns, there were the mortar rounds, which could easily tear through even the toughest of ships. Finally, at the front of the ship was a ram, which would deal severe damage to any ship that it would collide with head-on. Thanks to Edward's abilities as a captain, as well as the various upgrades he would give it throughout the years, the Jackdaw was one of the most dangerous ships of its time. The Morgan was a heavily customized 150-foot-long brigantine-style ship, originally used by the British Navy up until Shay would take it as his own. The Morgan's standard method of attack was its 34 standard broadside cannons with 17 along each side, that were capable of firing twice in quick succession before needing to be reloaded, as well as 4 Caradens at the front, which were cannons specialized for short-range anti-crew weapons. For secondary firepower, this ship was equipped with 4 puckle gun weapons with a higher rate of fire than most ship-based weapons had at the time, and served as rapid-fire cannons that could be used for precision shots as well as simply doing extra damage. The Morgan was equipped with burning oil to keep other ships from getting too close from behind, or thanks to the ship's high maneuverability, could circle a ship, forcing it to stay put or risk burning. The Morgan also had a specialized ram made for breaking solid ice in the Atlantic, but could also be used to deal heavy damage to enemy ships, as well as being equipped with around 15 mortar rounds. Thanks to funding by the Templar Order, the Morgan was quite possibly the most advanced ship of its time and was more than capable of taking on and sinking far larger ships due to both its advanced weaponry and its skilled captain. Both these ships and their captains were quite possibly the most dangerous at the time they were active, with both single-handedly destroying ships that were considered legendary, such as the El Impunto and the Storm Fortress, respectively. The Jackdaw was the bigger and likely the more armored of the 2 ships, but I actually don't see the Jackdaw's size as an advantage here, as being bigger would make it slower at turning and a much larger target, while on the other hand, the Morgan may not be able to take as much damage. It would be faster and more maneuverable, letting it evade damage better. As for their broadside cannons, while the Jackdaw has more on each side, the Morgan can fire twice in a row in quick succession, giving it overall more firepower in this department. I think their front-facing specialized cannon would actually even out, as they both serve as counters to the type of ship the other one is. The Jackdaw's chains would slow down the Morgan, impeding its maneuverability, and the Morgan's more damaging Caridins would be effective against the Jackdaw's armor, as well as take out some of its crew. Not only are the Morgan's puckle guns twice what the Jackdaw's swivel guns are, but they have a much higher rate of fire, as these weapons were some of the first to be considered machine guns. Their mortars are pretty much identical, with the only difference being that the Jackdaw can fire 5 more shots with a maximum of 20, giving it a slight advantage. While the Jackdaw's exploding barrels would probably do more damage, the Morgan's burning oil would be better for area control and denial, allowing Shay to keep the Jackdaw from going anywhere he didn't want it to. The Morgan's icebreaker ram by design would be much more durable than the Jackdaw, simply due to its main function of breaking solid ice. Overall, while the Morgan doesn't quite match the Jackdaw in terms of armor or firepower, its other equipment is perfect for outmaneuvering and outperforming the less advanced ship in every other category. And it is for this reason that I give the Morgan the edge as a ship. Like in all of my matchups, I will be using lightsaber fighting forms to better and more easily describe a fighter's approach to combat. Just like in my Geralt vs. Talion matchup, I think these two would actually use the exact same fighting forms. So to stop myself from just repeating the same thing, I'll be going over their forms first and then I'll get into their strategy. However, I fully admit that this is a conclusion based on the recycled gameplay and animations, but seeing as this is the most consistent point of reference I have, I will still be using them. The first form they will be using is Form 4 Ataru, a form primarily based on aggressive acrobatic maneuvers meant to quickly overwhelm a single opponent. A few weaknesses of this form is that it can quickly eat through a user's stamina and wouldn't be viable in confined spaces. The second form they will be using is Form 5 Xian/Jimso, a form focused on defending against incoming attacks and immediately counterattacking, often with quick, lethal strikes. The final form I think they would use would be Form 6 Niman, though mostly as a base for the other two. Form 6 was the generalized combination of the previous 5 forms of combat, as well as teaching to implement force abilities, or in the case of these two, their extra equipment, quickly and fluidly in the midst of battle. As for their preferences, I think Edward would lean more towards Ataru because of his mostly self-taught style, as well as the years as a pirate, requiring him to be a much more aggressive fighter. Meanwhile, I feel Shay would try to maintain a balance of all 3 forms thanks to his extensive training as an assassin. Edward wasn't formally trained up until his time as a privateer, when he would get trained by Edward Thatch and Benjamin Herringold at the age of 19 when he would serve as a privateer. As of the recording of this video, Edward may very well be the most aggressive playable character we've gotten, often rushing into combat with a flurry of blows capable of overwhelming multiple opponents at the same time. That being said, he was far from a mindless attacker, being able to switch from attack mode to defend mode at any point in a fight, or even use the environment around him to his advantage. After joining the Assassins, Edward would take their tactics and modify them to fit his own, more aggressive fighting style, making his skills one of the most unique amongst his fellow Order members. Shay would learn to fight at a young age, being trained in swordsmanship and marksmanship on his father's ship, and already being a skilled fighter by the time he was accepted into the Assassin Order at the age of 17, where his already impressive skills would be further improved with their training, up until Shay would defect from the Order and turn their own tactics against them, eventually nearing destroying the Order and killing 4 Master Assassins, 3 of which had a large part in his own training. Part of what made Shay such a deadly fighter was his flexibility in combat, being more than capable of switching to a defensive position to a crushing offense on the fly in combat. As a quick aside, while in gameplay Shay uses his sword and knife in the nearly identical way to Edward with his twin swords, it's far more likely that Shay used his sword and knife combo similarly to how Connor from Assassin's Creed 3 does. They likely received similar training from Achilles, just more directly in Connor's. As I'm sure you can tell by now, these two men are very similar fighters with a nearly identical approach to combat, again though mostly thanks to gameplay. Regardless, this is another fight that I feel could realistically go either way, but I do feel that one of these two just has a bit more going for him than the other. During my research, I came across some information that shocked me, that being that by the end of each of their respective games, Shay actually had more combat experience than Edward. In fact, Edward didn't learn to use his sword up until his time as a privateer in 1712, when he would have already been 19 years old. Meanwhile, at the age of 16, Shay was already a trained fighter, having learned to fight on his father's ship and even having fought and killed a pirate captain. While Edward may be using a modified version of the Assassin's Order's tactics, they are still tactics that Shay was better trained to use and has spent several years countering and successfully using against the very order that developed them. To use an example from 3 Topics Gamer, another YouTuber that I think fits perfectly, Shay is the Darth Vader of the Assassin's Creed franchise, having taken everything the Order has taught him and using it to drive them to the brink of distinction, personally killing several master assassins. Now, while Edward would by no means be an easy fight, even for someone like Shay, I believe that Shay just has more going for him overall as a fighter, being better trained, having more combat experience, and using the training he has more effectively. And it is for these reasons that I give Shay the edge in combat skills and tactics. Let's set up this fight. Let's say that thanks to a pair of curious employees in Abstergo messing around with the Animus, they managed to simulate a hypothetical battle between these two. The simulation loads both Edward and Shay onto their respective ships in the open ocean, starting at around 1,000 feet apart. The two ships would immediately start moving towards each other. As soon as they were in firing range, the front-facing cannons of both ships would firing off, with the Morgan shot missing while the Jackdaw's chain shot catches one of its target's sails. As both weapons are being reloaded, they pass each other and both ships fire off, both taking a good amount of damage, but the Morgan being worse off. That is until a moment later when its second shot fires off, though about a quarter of its shots miss. Both ships begin turning, but the Morgan, being faster and more maneuverable, already has the Jackdaw in range. Both shots off before the Jackdaw is fully turned, staggering the crew. Seeing this, Shay then steers the Morgan straight ahead and moves forward at ramming speed. Edward tells his crew to brace, saving several crew members, but the damage to the Jackdaw is still done. Former pirate gets in some distance between them and steers away, but does manage to grab one of his flintlocks and shoot a crew member off the Morgan out of spite. As he puts the smallest ship behind him, he then lets loose some explosive barrels that explode the moment they come into contact with the Morgan. As Edward creates some distance between him and the Templar, he can tell that this won't be an ordinary fight and tells his men to be ready for anything while planning his attack. Shay, meanwhile, is approaching fast, content to keep the current strategy, and begins circling around to attack again when the Jackdaw starts firing mortars. Shay does his best to avoid the mortars, taking only minor damage, but as he continues to circle the Jackdaw, he orders his men to let out the burning oil, cutting off the path in front of the Jackdaw. Eventually, after making Edward and his ship a stationary target, they begin unloading the Morgan's own mortars as well as their broadside cannons. Even with the Jackdaw surrounded by danger on all sides, this is far from an easy fight, and both ships take a considerable amount of damage. But once the dust settles, it's the Jackdaw that can't continue fighting anymore. Shay immediately moves in and both crews prepare for the incoming fight. As the Morgan reels in the Jackdaw, both crews begin firing at one another, and Shay would stay on his ship firing his puckle gun at the Jackdaw's crew, while Edward uses a pulley to quickly make his way up the sails and Shay snipers before they can kill any of his men. Taking a moment to look at the Morgan's crew, he immediately picks out Shay in the crowd, and as the Templar moves under him, he pounces, knocking Shay to the floor, thrusting his dagger forward, forcing Edward far enough back for Shay to kick him off. Both men roll to their feet, drawing their swords, and Edward wastes no time sizing Shay up and goes on the immediate offense, trying to overwhelm Shay, who easily keeps up with the assassin and even responds with an equally aggressive attacks. The two quickly finding themselves in a stalemate, though eventually these two would enter into a brief blade lock with Shay push Edward back, and just as he does, Shay grabs onto his rope dart and throws it into Edward's leg, pulling it out from under him and dropping Edward to his back. Shay stomps down on Edward's face and raises his sword for the kill. However, Edward recovers, pulling out one of his flintlock pistols and shooting Shay in the shoulder, knocking him back. Both men stumble back to their feet, and now both injured go back to their stalemate. With standard swordplay again failed to get any results, they both turn to the environment to finish the fight. Shay would try to throw Edward off the ship, and in retaliation, Edward would bash Shay's head against the mast. Eventually, Edward would catch one of Shay's attempts to stab him, and with the flick of his wrist would almost cut Shay's hand, forcing him to drop the dagger. Now forced to a single weapon, Shay tries to keep up with Edward's barrage of attacks, but is finding he is losing more ground, and decides that he has to end this now. Dodging a strike from Edward and putting as much force as he can into the strike, knocks one of Edward's blades from his hand, leaving himself open. Edward goes in for a stab, but his hand is caught by Shay, who tries to bring his own blade down on Edward's neck, but the pirate is able to catch his strikes to begin trying to brute force the other. Knowing his injured shoulder and hand puts him at a disadvantage here, Shay would kick Edward's injured leg, trying to inflict as much pain as he could to overwhelm the assassin. Edward, however, rather than simply trying to brute force the blade, tilts it until it's lined up with Shay's abdomen before pulling the gun sword's trigger. All the air is suddenly knocked out of Shay as he falls to his knees, clutching his gut as Edward grabs his collar and pulls him up with a scowl, saying, "Better luck next time." Shay, however, wastes no time waiting for Edward to grab his weapons and thrusts his hidden blade forward, stabbing Edward in the throat. "I make my own luck," the Templar says in an almost smug manner. Edward lurches back, putting as much pressure to the wound as he can, but it's already too late. And after a few more moments, the assassin falls to the ground where he bleeds out, and the simulation ends. And with that, I declare Shay Cormac, the Assassin Hunter, the winner. And that will do it for the penultimate matchup of my first season. Thank you all for watching, but now that it's over, I'd like to hear what all you guys have. As this is really another one of those matches where I feel could realistically go in either direction, but thanks to Shay's experience in taking down Master Assassins and Pirates like Edward, I don't think Edward's really bringing anything that Shay hasn't already dealt with, and especially when you consider that Shay bested an older and more experienced Adewale as a captain. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below, and if I got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. With that being everything, I'm Ray932, and I will see you for the season finale.
Persona.
From the sea of thy soul I come. I am Orpheus, master of strings. I am thou. Thou art I. The time has come. Open thine eyes and call forth what is within.
What the?